Here we go. Great. Okay. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you, whenever you're joining us from any part of the world. So thank you so much for your time. My name is Hiba Ibrahim, and I'm the founding president of the Graduate Students SIG, or interest group at the Collaboration. And I'm really excited to welcome you all to this second webinar that we are designing on mixed methods in virtual exchange research. Before we get started, I just would like to share with you all a little bit about our SIG. So I'm so glad that Janita is able to join us here today. So we actually started the SIG around a year ago, and Janita Poe, who actually now, Dr. Janita Poe, who graduated, just finished her PhD, has been a wonderful, partner supporting with all the SIG work for the past year, and I'm so glad that I have her as vice president of the SIG. And as I said, we are officially a part of Collaboration. Collaboration is a cross-disciplinary professional organization for telecollaboration and virtual exchange in higher education contexts. We would love for you to become a member or a student member. It's only 25 euros a year for students. And I'm going also to just type the link in the chat in a moment. And this is how you can actually get officially part of our SIG. You can receive information about our future events. You have access to resources. You learn about conferences and projects that Collaboration is doing. Also get some discounts on some of the Collaboration trainings. So all interesting resources for virtual exchange researchers and practitioners as well. And for us, really, the primary goals of the SIG is that we are trying to build this multidisciplinary community of graduate students researching virtual exchange from different parts of the world. We are hoping by doing so to increase the impact of the organization by promoting diversity and inclusion of academic and professional contributions in VE. Since we all come from different disciplines, we speak different languages, we come from different contexts. So we all have our own contribution and understanding of virtual exchange and its practice. So we are hoping then by conducting all these different services that we help you, have a voice and connect with other graduate students who are also, researching something similar to yours. So as I said, if you haven't seen the Padlet yet, it would be nice to, post your introduction so we could stay in touch in the future. So for today, I'm really pleased to be with or introducing actually Professor Bart Rienties, who is going to be our speaker for today's webinar. He is a professor of learning analytics and program lead of the Learning Analytics and Learning Design research program at the Institute of Educational Technology at the Open University in the UK. He leads a group of academics who provide university-wide learning analytics and learning design solutions and conduct evidence-based research of how students and professionals learn. He has published over 285 academic outputs and is the second most published author on networks in education in the period between 1969 and 2020. He is also the fourth most cited author and contributor in learning analytics in the period between 2011 to 2018, and the fifth most published author on internationalization in the period 1900 to 2018. I am personally so thrilled that we have him here today. And that being said, we're just going to have you, get us started. Please feel free to type in questions in the chat or raise your hand if you have any questions. Professor Rienties actually prefers a kind of discussion model of the webinar. So if you have anything you would like to comment on or to ask, use the chat, raise your hand, and he will be there for you. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Professor Rienties. Thank you.
Thank you, and please just call me Bart. It's really awkward, and it's a nice informal group. And I just posted in the chat it's really nice to read the Padlet and to see that you're from all across the globe, all from different cultures. And I feel a little bit like a fraud because I'm not an expert in virtual exchange. I think 5 or 6 years ago, much more well-established researchers in language invited some of my research members to help with an evaluation project on virtual exchange. And yeah, I'm going to show you today a little bit about what we've learned from these various virtual exchanges, but you probably know more about virtual exchanges than I do. So if I'm saying something wrong or strange, just let me know. I'm not an expert in virtual exchanges, but I'm really interested in internationalization. That's, I think one of my main passions and hobbies. So right, let's start the PowerPoint, and I think we're here. And feel free, I'm following the chat at the same time as well. So if there's anything, if I'm speaking too fast or too slow, if I'm not clear, let me know. So I think we're all familiar with virtual exchange. I didn't know beforehand if we were familiar, but I think we're all familiar with it. It's been termed in many different ways: telecollaboration, online intercultural exchange. And in a recent innovative pedagogy report, which we wrote together with Beijing University, we indicated in 2021 that we think that virtual exchange / telecollaboration is one of the really big innovations for the next couple of years. So it's nice to see that this has been mainstreamed. And for those who don't really know what virtual exchange is, it could be like what we wrote in the innovative pedagogy report. It could be one wanting to learn German and wanting to understand a little bit more before he goes to Germany. And at the same time, there could be a German student who wants to learn Spanish. And by linking these two people together, they could share cross-cultural experiences, but also learn a language at the same time. And increasingly, there are also lots of opportunities for people in informal context. I mean, the internet is one big informal context to basically have the opportunity to learn from people from different cultures. I mean, when I started to study in Sweden in 1999 and actually stayed there for a year, it was like, wow, this is fantastic. But I appreciate that not everyone has an opportunity to study in different countries across the globe. And virtual exchange is a great way to learn different cultures. So while there is a lot of literature on virtual exchange, I think one of the reasons why we did this so-called Evaluate project, and I will explain a little bit more in a minute, is that there are some key concerns about research. So what I'm trying to say, I mean, if I'm not trying to offend any researchers, I'm just saying, okay, this is what we see from the literature, where there are potential gaps, and I hope that together we as a community can address this. So a big concern often in virtual exchange research is the kind of validity of the research and whether or not it's evidence-based. So there have been a range of meta-studies that show that virtual exchanges are mostly qualitative or descriptive studies, and mostly describe, okay, how did a teacher implement virtual exchange? And these studies are really useful and valuable, but oftentimes these studies conclude, yes, it really worked. But how do you know that it really works? And in a very good review of 350 computer-assisted language learning studies by Golanka in 2014, the researchers basically concluded that a lot of research in language studies is often very descriptive with relatively small samples. And oftentimes these studies are not really using like comparison groups or control groups. So how do you know when students say, oh, I've learned to work with people from a different culture? How do you know that that's really the case, and whether or not it's actually better than students who, for example, didn't participate in the virtual exchange? So I think that was one of the reasons that we initially started this Evaluate project. And then as we started to work through the project several years ago, we also realized that there could be a kind of mediating role of technology and affinity to technology in terms of whether or not students are successful in virtual exchange. How do these social relationships are formed between students, and how are they maintained across different cultures? And another gap that we found was oftentimes there is Yeah, a limited amount of mixed methods research. And I'm a keen user of mixed methods research. Yes, it's difficult. Yes, hopefully you are all convinced of this approach. But it's difficult to do this. So what I will tell you today is basically, and hopefully we're going to have some really interesting discussions, is how we've started to address some of these gaps. And the main context, as I mentioned before, is this Evaluate project. And there's a really cool report which you can just Google and then find it. And basically, these were 25 virtual exchanges facilitated by 33 training institutions across the globe, mostly from Europe, but also we worked with Brazil, with Macau, with Israel, I think also with Canada and the US. And over 1,000 students participated in these programs. And what was also really cool was that we involved a range of ministries of education. So it was a kind of big project. And we were really keen to do this in a so-called evidence-based way. So just to give you kind of an overview of what we did and why we think it's called a mixed method study, what you see here is that basically before we started with the telecollaboration or the virtual exchange, we asked participants to fill in a pre-test survey to know, okay, where did students start with in terms of technology? I will explain this in a minute. We asked them to complete a diary at the start to understand, okay, why are you joining this virtual exchange? What are your expectations? What are you hoping to achieve? And then they worked for a period of 65 days on 3 authentic tasks. So they had to work in cross-cultural groups. They had to jointly create a range of products. It could be like designing a new virtual learning task or some language activities. And at the same time, they kept their diaries on an individual basis. And then at the end of the telecollaboration or the virtual exchange, they completed one more diary, and then there was the post-test survey. So there's a nice pre-post-test design. And we then divided, we were mainly interested in 3 core concepts, and I will primarily touch on the first one, but of course there are other researchers that have looked more at the other aspects. So the aspect that we were mostly interested in is to what extent do a kind of teacher technology skills and understanding of teaching and designing online materials, to what extent does this mediate how students are learning in the virtual exchange? Partially, I'm mostly interested in this because I'm not a language educator, but other teachers were much more interested in the kind of intercultural effectiveness. So we also measured at the pre-test and the post-test, the Portela and Shen intercultural effectiveness scale. And last but not least, we also measured students' perceived foreign language competencies. So I'm seeing a question from Mark. I'm trying to keep track of everything. Yeah, so there were not only language education. Most of the teachers were language teachers or pre-service language teachers, but nearly all of them were pre-service teachers. So it could also well be that people were just learning to teach in a primary school, and then they use technology. So in that sense, we were interested in all these 3 big concepts. So thank you for raising that question, Mark. So we basically divided the study into 2 phases. In phase 1, we did an RCT, a randomized control trial study, where in this case, 151 participants from Sweden, Spain, Hungary, and Germany were randomly allocated in the treatment group or the control condition. And basically the control condition was then following just normal classes. And they were, the correct term is delayed treatment design. They were then enrolled in a virtual exchange, the next phase. So they were not necessarily disadvantaged, they just didn't get the virtual exchange at the first go. And they were all studying in courses like English language or Didactica 2, for example. And then the second study we did was basically, we gave the courses to 790 participants. But in the second phase, we didn't have a control group anymore, but we had, of course, a control group from the first group. So just a quick question in the chat, maybe. Do you think that in comparison to the control group, the virtual exchange participants gained more in terms of their technology skills? Just write yes or no. Okay. That's of course what so that's where everyone is saying yes. Is anyone brave enough to tell me why you think it is yes? We don't have to, but just keen to hear your voice. It's fine if you do. I mean, it's fine. We can also just use the chat. So we were also expecting, you know, when we spent all this 65 days, all this intensive labor, we were assuming that if you put these students into this amazing virtual exchanges, surely they must do better than the control group, because that's what we've been, you know, doing for a range of, you know, years with virtual exchanges. So the results were actually, in a way, kind of shocking, and in a way disappointing. So what you see here is the pre-test score and the post-test score on TPAC, and it's a scale from 1 to 5. And if you look at the blue line, which is the experiment group versus the control group, yes, there is a little bit of difference, but the difference is actually not statistically significant. And that is really interesting. So first of all, you can ask yourself, okay, why did the control group become more confident about their technology skills over time? And secondly, the really interesting question is, why weren't these students who were in these really innovative virtual exchanges, why didn't they increase more over time? So the next thing we, of course, looked at is, for example, their intercultural competence. And again, the effects were not as positive as we were initially anticipating. So yes, the experimental group did better than the control group, but they also started at a slightly higher level. And the difference at the end of the post-test is actually not statistically significant. Here we're just showing the results overall, but if you control for lots of factors, we basically didn't find a real effect. And of course, this is difficult because we have to explain to our funders, you know, is it working? And the short answer is we're not really sure if it's better than the control group. In plain numbers, we did see that 77% of the experimental students had a positive intercultural competence score in comparison to the 69% of the control groups. On the one hand, you could say, well, it's higher, but yeah, it's not significantly more. And this is also, I think, one of the main lessons, I think, from what I'm hopefully trying to say. If you wouldn't have the control group, you could just conclude, yes, 83% of the virtual exchange participants felt that their intercultural skills improved. But if you don't know what the benchmark is, you might conclude, yes, it really worked. So what we're encouraging researchers to do, irrespective of virtual exchanges, is think about, okay, how do we know that this 83% is really good? Of course, it's great, but it's, so this put us to a kind of dilemma, because of course we needed to explain why these quantitative results didn't lead to the results that we were expecting. So what we have tried to do in a range of studies, and I can't show them all, but we primarily went along 4 different avenues. So one is to dig more into the quant data. That's one route. And then is to triangulate it with qualitative data. For example, look at the diaries, look at the log data. We, of course, also interviewed students. Then we did cluster analysis. And lastly, we recently published a paper on the social network relations. So let's have a look at what we've learned. So we mostly focused on TPAC, and we just have one more paper on interculturals, but it's not yet published, so I can't share this yet. So if we, for example, look at the 3 virtual exchanges individually, so we just showed you the overall virtual exchange experimental condition, but maybe it was that within the virtual exchanges themselves, there were certain virtual exchanges that did really well. And here the dashed line is basically the control group, and the solid line is the experimental group. And there's not really a clear pattern in this. So for example, if we take the triangular group, the diamond group, yes, the group is going substantially higher, but if you compare it to the control group, yes, it's a little bit higher, but it's actually not statistically significant. What is quite interesting, for example, with the square group, that's another virtual exchange, they were really confident at the beginning and remained very confident. While if we compare it with the experimental group, well, they didn't really catch up. So it seems that on the individual virtual exchanges, again, there's not really a super positive effect. If we, for example, then look at the other virtual exchanges in the second study, perhaps, this is just an outlier. This is just, 3 experimental virtual exchanges that perhaps just didn't do what we were expecting to do. So the next one shows the growth of these virtual exchanges, of the 20 virtual exchanges over time. And what I found really fascinating is that if you compare it with the control group, the dashed line in this particular case, there are some virtual exchanges that even go downwards. So the dark green, they went from really confident to, well, slightly less confident. There's some courses that start really low and go extremely high. And there are some courses which don't really progress. And of course, these are just data of aggregate virtual exchanges, but there are real people behind it. So Hiba, you have a question, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, there's a question in the chat from Sina asking, are all of the results based on student self-reports?
Yes, that's a very good question. So these are all self-report questions based on validated questions from questionnaires, pragmatic questionnaires from Smith et al., which is based on the follow-up work of Mishler and Kuhler. So obviously there could be what some call the Dunning-Kruger effect, that novices tend to overestimate their capabilities and experts are more realistic about their capabilities. But at the same time, of course, because we crunch these numbers over a large group of participants, why would the control group be more realistic about their expectations or vice versa? So it is a caveat, and that's, I guess, why we're also very keen to, in not only in this paper, but also in other papers, to look at the underlying data, what's behind this. So the next phase, we started to look at the more triangulation, or the triangulation of the data. So this is the same visualization as this, but in a slightly different way. So what you see here is the pre-test scores and then the post-test scores, and these are the numbers, these are the virtual exchanges. And you see, for example, exchange 18, I don't know which one this is, had a relatively low pre-test score, but also didn't necessarily improve at the post-test. And there are some, like for example, 9, 8, or 1, that had a relatively low pre-test score, but made substantial improvements over time. So we decided, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into one of this to start to learn, okay, why is it that some participants, or at least some participants, indicated that they've made some substantial growth. So what you see here is the actual participants. So these are the actual participants in the visualization, and how they change from the pre-test to the post-test. So again, I've been talking a lot, and I'm keen to listen to you. What do you see in this lovely visualization? There's no test, it's just, I'm just keen to hear what you think.
What's the difference in the diamond and the circle? Is that based on gender, or is that something more significant? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a very good question. No, I should have probably explained that. So one color, I can't remember which one it is. One is one group of students, I think the Polish students, and I think the purple ones are the, I think it's purple, are the German students.
So that shows a difference in the country where they came from, because one set of students had, I guess, higher intercultural, or sorry, higher TPAC perception at the beginning, and then they went higher while the other set had lower ones and then could have more growth.
Yeah. Yeah, and what to me is also really fascinating, and that's I think why mixed method research is really interesting. You have, for example, I mean, I don't know these students, right? We've anonymized this. So you have student 7, who started with 2 out of 5 and then grew to a 3.5. So this person has made a substantial gain. But in comparison to all the other students, this student is still relatively far below the rest of the group. So it would be really interesting to know, okay, why is this the case? Or for example, I'm just picking on student 3. Student 3 was very comfortable at the beginning, but then towards the end of the course, the student was actually less confident in terms of his or her technology skills. And of course, the great thing with mixed methods approaches is that you can unpack some of these narratives. And what we did in this particular study, we actually did interviews with these students and follow-up focus groups to try to understand, okay, what are the narratives behind it, and why is it in this particular case, if I remember the study correctly, why is it that the German students, the purple students, seem to be more confident towards the end of the course in terms of their TPIC scores relative to the Polish students? And we also looked at the diaries that students kept, and we looked at the interactions that we were able to monitor in the virtual learning environment. And we also looked at the end of course reflection document. And I'm mindful of time because I want to show lots of other interesting studies. But basically what we found, and there are lots of really good, if you're interested, have a look at the actual paper. But it seemed that this kind of growth of students over time seemed to be heavily influenced by people's prior experience and access to technology, and also whether they were already familiar with working with people with different cultures or not. And that's of course really difficult to probe from a quantitative perspective. So in a follow-up, sorry, go ahead.
So I have a question or comment. So the language was English, is that correct?
I have to say I can't remember, but I think yes.
So I was thinking with the German students, I mean, English is a Germanic language. I don't know about Polish, I shouldn't say this, but I'm just wondering for other reasons, not just the language, that maybe they were more comfortable in the language that was used. I mean, that's something I'm encountering right away is if it's not your first language and you're in these exchanges, then there are these fears that crop up about having to use a second or third language. But I don't know. If that
Yeah,
was
I think that's a very good and valid comment. Thank you for that, Janita. I mean, I can't remember the exact details, and the people who actually did all the qualitative analysis, Miriam Hauk and Andreas Müller-Hartmann, they're linguists. So I think in the paper itself, they also looked at the language component. Of course, for both, it's a second language. And my own personal take on this is that oftentimes when I meet Polish students, they speak oftentimes much better English than most of our German students. So it could be either way.
interesting.
Yeah.
And I'll just say one other thing. I worked with a group. We were Georgia State, which is the United States, and then we had students from China and from Hong Kong. And so, and I apologize for assuming maybe the Germans were more comfortable. Of course, the students from Hong Kong were much more comfortable with English, and they seem to be more engaged and have a better experience. So that's why. So I have it backwards, though. If that's the case, that's not explaining the numbers. Thank you.
Yeah, no, and it's really interesting. And also, I mean, one of the things which we didn't do in this particular study is we know the language and language proficiency, and we've measured it also at the end of the course. But of course, like with any kind of study, there are always certain limitations, and I don't think we've checked it in this paper. I think in the next paper that I'm trying to show, I think we have checked this. So in the next paper, it seems virtual exchange 1 again, but it's actually a different virtual exchange, but we coded it as virtual exchange 1 and virtual exchange 2. We had students from Portugal and Brazil, so they had the same language, they could communicate in Portuguese. And then we specifically chose another virtual exchange that they had to work in their second language, namely Spanish. And what we try to identify, and this is a similar visualization as the one before, we try to identify who are the students who make self-reported really high gains. So they're the green ones, if you like, in this visualization. Who are the ones that are, let's say, above 0 is basically a positive gain? Who are those students? And then last but not least, who are the students who perhaps, well, make a negative gain sounds negative, but basically they initially thought they were, let's say, a 4, and then when they started to interact with people over time, after 65 days, they indicated that they were slightly less. So what we did here was to first do the number crunching, and then afterwards we looked at the diaries that students kept in these courses. And we analyzed over 465 entries by my colleague Irina Retz. And we found some really interesting similarities and differences. So this is the coding book that we used, and we did thematic analysis, and we identified 5 common themes that were present in the data. And then we triangulated this back to the cluster that students belong to. So the cluster 1 is the high students in terms of they made high gains. Cluster 2 is the mid gains, and cluster 3 are the low gains. And what we found across the three clusters is that mostly the students are very positive about the technology that they use in virtual exchange, but at the same time, it also allowed them to develop their technological literacy. But what was quite interesting, and this is where I think you see also in the numerical coding, where the pictures were kind of slightly different, we found that how students were able to overcome some of these difficulties were different. So for example, in cluster 3, that is the low group of students, they reported much more negative experiences in the diary. So for example, one student wrote, in my group, we use Google Drives in order to share a presentation with our partner group. But this student indicated, it's a female, she used the system well before. So she indicated she didn't learn that much because she already knew how to work with the system. And another person from Spain said, I didn't understand why they decided to work on a different task and didn't contribute to any of the ideas. So that's one group of participants. And at the same time, for example, we found that these high performing students were in particular more managing kind of major breakthroughs in terms of, being able to overcome some of the issues. So for example, this student from Portugal, it's again a female, was initially, she didn't feel comfortable with the technology, but once she started to overcome some of these difficulties, she really started to like the use of technology. So I'm just following the chat. Do you know how the others analyze the qualitative data? And that's a question from Simone. And how did we? So Irina Retz, in this particular study, she used NVivo to code all the participants' data, and then she linked this back on the one hand to the individual participants. So we did also lots of quantitative analysis in terms of, what does gender or culture influence your behavior, but also from the cluster analysis, we then try to link this. So I hope this answers your question, Simone. And then how did you do the cluster analysis? So we basically identified in the actual quantitative data, we looked at the TPAC scores, the pre and post, and then in statistical programs like SPSS or R, it then tries to fit and identify these 3 unique clusters based on data that you provide. And of course, with any kind of cluster analysis, you can easily critique it because maybe we should have also incorporated, for example, language skills, or we should have included, for example, intercultural competencies. But in this particular case, we were primarily interested in technology because that's what we mostly do at my institution. So I hope that helps. I hope you see basically that there is a story developing, that increasingly we're doing more sophisticated stuff in terms of our analysis of all this data. And in the third study that I'm hopefully trying to share with you today, we were really interested in another group that used the same primary language, in this case, Portuguese. So we selected one group from Macau, and Macau is technically from China. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not phrasing it politically correct, but it's technically part of China. But oftentimes, many of the students, because of the unfortunate colonial heritage, they are, they can speak Portuguese, or they are keen to learn about Portugal. And at the same time, we then linked them with an institute in Portugal. And we're just really keen to see how they developed their learning relationships, and also how they developed over time. So if we look at the quantitative data, again, and apologies that I'm wishing through all the quantitative data, we found in our overall studies that in all so-called Western virtual exchange participants had a positive learning gain, while participants from Asian students, and we didn't have a lot of Asian students in our setting, seemed to have a negative learning gain over time. And in this particular virtual exchange, we found that Portuguese students had a negative gain, and the Chinese students had a positive gain. So we're really interested, okay, why is it that Portuguese students have a negative gain and Chinese students in this particular case have a positive gain? So again, of course, we looked at the diaries, we coded lots of data, but in particular, a new element was we looked at the social networks that participants developed. So we asked in this particular case, at the end of the course, name 5 people that you have learned with in your virtual exchange. And we found some really interesting data, and this is the scary social network. So what you can see is that the dark shaded colors are basically participants from Portugal, and the light shaded people are the people from China. And you can see also in terms of gender, the shape, whether it's a male or female. So for example, Manuela from Portugal learned from Vicky, and learned from Amelia, and learned from Jack. But this particular person, Manuela, didn't learn from some of the other participants. So it's a really informative way to see, okay, with whom did people connect? And this allows us also to see whether or not, people were able to connect beyond their own domestic group. So some of the qualitative data really allowed us to then go much deeper into understanding some of these quantitative findings. So for example, Mila, which of course is not her real name, she indicated, I find it very interesting to participate in a project like this one because I don't have the opportunity to go to China and to get to know their local habits, et cetera, But at the same time, she stressed that there were some challenges in terms of communicating, and she felt that it was sometimes difficult when her colleagues didn't intervene in terms of certain activities. They didn't pose a lot of questions, or communication was often difficult. And at the same time, if we then look at a Macau student, she had a slightly different experience. She thought it was really interesting and rewarding, and she learned a lot about different culture and climate. So I guess what I'm trying to say in an inarticulate way is there are multiple mixed perspectives on all the virtual exchanges. And that's why I think it's so useful to use these mixed method approaches, because it allows you to unpack some of these nuances in the findings. So I'm keen to get to the discussion and have a discussion with you. So I think what we've learned over all these studies is that if you're doing virtual exchange research, I think it's really important to think about, okay, how do we know that it worked? And how do we know that it worked? Ideally should be tested with some kind of comparison group, because we could have easily went back to our funders to state, for example, in our setting, yes, it worked. But if we look at the control group, they did equally well. So in a way, you can't conclude that it's worked. So we're also very mindful that when people say in your research, yes, it worked, how do you know that it worked relative to something that you want to compare it with? And one way to do is to do pre-post testing. And I think another thing that hopefully we showed today is that by going beyond the numerical data and by triangulating the quants with the qual data and the qual data back to the quants data, it really provides a very fine-grained opportunity for us to understand both the cognitive, social, and behavioral data from learners in a virtual exchange. And I haven't really mentioned this, but in the papers, we have been able to show with all the kinds of modeling that technology skills, foreign language competence, and social networking predict whether or not virtual exchange participants benefit from all these lovely learning opportunities. And last but not least, what we've learned over the years, and we're still working with this data, is that mixed method research is really hard. It's really labor intensive. And what in particular is hard is that you oftentimes have to work with people from very different disciplines and very different epistemological beliefs. But it's also really exciting because once you cross those different interdisciplinary boundaries, you actually learn much more. So I'm keen to listen to your thoughts. If you're interested in terms of mixed method research, we've just published a recent book by 18 PhD students on open world learning. It's a shameless plug, but you can download this book for free. And we've also done, if you're more interested in mixed methods, how to do this, we've also published a book on mixed method social network analysis. So shameless plug, and looking forward to your questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Bart. And if it's okay with you, is it okay if you can just copy and paste the links to the books in the chat?
Yeah. Let me just do that now, and I will also share later on the slides, of course. Sorry, I forgot to do this.
So while you do that, I'm just gonna mention a few questions I see in the chat here. And please, everybody, also help us learn about your experience by filling in this short survey before you leave today. Would really appreciate it. So we had a question from a registrant. I'm not sure if they're here today, but the question was, what data collection methods can be used in a good mixed method study or research?
How long is a piece of string? I think any kind of method is interesting to use. I think it's more about, okay, what's the research question you're trying to address? And I hope that by sharing a range of mixed method studies today, you just get a flavor of, hey, this could be interesting. Let's try this. I think there's no ideal mixed method study, but I'm a strong proponent of mixed methods because it allows you to see the world from a slightly different perspective. And I think that's what is really cool.
I personally had a question, but I think I'll return this later. Janita also had a question. If you can tell us what study group did, or how many exchanges, in contrast to what the control group did in, I think, the first study you mentioned, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So if I'm still sharing the screen, so the control group basically just continued studying at their normal degree in their normal institution over the 65 days. So the only new thing that the virtual exchange participants did was they, in addition to their normal day-to-day program, they were involved in these 3 authentic tasks where they worked together with people from wherever the virtual exchange was. So in a sense, from just purely a kind of engagement perspective, you would guess that because this good experimental group spent more time, you would hope that they would develop more intercultural skills and also more technology skills. But from a statistical point of view, that didn't seem to be the case.
I personally had a question about, it's a big question, but I think we can maybe talk about it a bit. Especially, I think a lot of people who are used to qualitative research, but interested in conducting mixed methods research, and they don't necessarily have strong skills in quantitative research. How can they make the decision to conduct mixed methods? Or in other words, when do you think it's best to conduct mixed methods? It's just if you feel that you're not there still on your quantitative research skills, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think one thing is to just reach out. For example, in this research group, Miriam and Andreas are fantastic qualitative researchers. They could do things which I can't, but they decided, okay, we need those quantitative nerds like Katrina and me to do the number crunching. And then by working together as a team, we actually shared data, we shared different perspectives, and we had lots of interesting discussions trying to make sense of data that we showed here. And I think the real merit is, I think in any institution or in any network, there are people who are strong in one skill, but perhaps not so strong in another. So by working together, that's a way to do it. And alternatively, and I think this is also described in the mixed method book, when I started to do my research, there was no YouTube, there was no internet to learn all these skills, but there's so many fantastic channels out there to learn these quantitative and qualitative skills and how to triangulate this. So, just give it a go. And I think you can learn it. And there must be somewhere, I mean, I'm a strong proponent of social networks. That's also why we, of course, wrote this book. There must be someone either in this community or someone in your organization that can perhaps help you along the way. And then hopefully, you can write some really interesting research.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? We still have 10 minutes before we end the webinar.
I guess I have two. One is, since I am a beginning researcher and I'm starting to build my social networks, the type of project you described is not something I could do on my own, but I'm not sure how I could find a team or become part of that type of project, because it sounds incredible. The Evaluate research is a dream in some way in terms of the amount of data you were able to collect and the coordination. So I guess one is just how to get started finding a team. And my other one just escaped my mind. So that's really my question, how to start building that social networking team.
Yeah, I think already the Padlet tool is amazing, because you will probably see that there are some people that have similar interests than you, or might give you access to networks that you're not currently connected to. So oftentimes, I mean, in the good old days before COVID, you would meet each other at conference and have a conversation. Hey, you're also interested in this. Maybe we should write a paper together. And I encourage my own PhD students, and I think this is also a reflection in the Open World Learning book that we wrote, is, just have conversations with people and see if you can write or do research together. And what we found is actually you learn so much more together. And it's actually a good strategy to start to think, hey, maybe there's someone in this group that I would like to work together with. And if that person has the same, you can hit two birds with one stone. So just network and see if there's some joint interest. And sorry to put Heba on the spot, but maybe there's also a great opportunity to provide a network of people that have similar interest, and then work together.
Can I say something? Well, I've carried out 3 control studies now, and it's really, really hard work. It's their mixed methods experiments, and I work with two really great researchers from SUNY, Brockport, but really we spend so much time designing the experiments, and every single thing we have to think out of, every little change, every little detail. It's mind-blowing. So I think this will be my 3rd one, and I'm not doing any more after this. And this is just setting it up. This is not even analyzing the data. It's not even writing the paper.
Yeah, I feel your pain, and several of my PhD students had to do this hardcore experimental studies, and then they in the end found out that, again, for example, the experiment didn't work. But to me, these are really fundamental questions, because we make the assumption that a particular treatment works. But if it doesn't, for me, that's really exciting, because it leads to much more questions to try and understand why it worked or why it didn't work.
Yeah, and I mean, I've collected a lot of data now. In my first study, I didn't have the video data. In the second study, I have video data from all of their online sessions and the focus groups. So I'm looking for ways to look at how they learned as well. So in addition to the quantitative data, and also the reflection reports, but to observe them working together and to see actually how they're learning, that will be interesting addition, but no walk in the park.
Now, if research was easy, everyone could get a PhD.
Yeah.
Or And
Well,
I think it's also really exciting because in a way, 20 years ago, you didn't have access to all this amazing data. And now it's like you have this enormous treasure trove. So where do you start?
Yeah. Storage. You need a lot of storage.
Okay, I thought of my other question that escaped is how do you balance this, I guess, generalized view in terms of the quantitative data that's a lot of people at the same time versus very local context that really can influence how you can make these comparisons, as we already saw between like the Polish students and the German students. How do you take that into account in this mixed method research?
Yeah, everyone is different. I'm just really puzzled. I'm just excited about every kind of weird data question. So when we started with Miriam, she was so convinced that these German students would learn so well. And then when I showed her the initial scatter plot, like I shown you today, it's like, oh, it's really interesting because there's some learners who really learn as measured by the self-report and some who didn't. And this raises really interesting questions about, okay, why didn't certain students not learn, if you see what I'm trying to say. So I think for me, it's always about the research questions and, what's the spark. And that's why I like, if you Google me, I publish a lot, but I also publish with a large number of people because I think it's really exciting when you bring different people together. We all have different interests. And I've learned probably much more from my colleagues than they have learned from me. So I'm not giving a straight answer because I don't think there is a straight answer. I think it's all about what you're passionate about, and then hopefully you will find in the end some great truth in your data. And if not, then let's keep digging.
Can I ask, I don't know if I'm on mute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Mark, we can.
Yeah, great. No, I can't hear you, which is really awkward. Okay, quick question. I'm curious as to when the qualitative focus groups were happening. I think you said focus groups, didn't you? Do you know if they asked about other potential types of learning, or were they just focused on technology and intercultural? So was that...
Good question. I wasn't part of that of the focus groups. I know from working with Miriam and Andreas that they did it quite quickly after the virtual exchange finished. But I wasn't part of the actual focus group. So hopefully in the actual article it is explained.
Okay,
and
great.
Not,
and a follow-up question, if I may, if no one else has got any questions. I'm curious as to how, you've mentioned triangulation. How did you control? It's known that when you have scale-based measures in psychology, that you have a tendency for people to give. There's demand characteristics, isn't there? You nearly always see an effect because people are keen to say that they've learned something. So how can you control for that that known effect? I know you've mentioned the triangulation. I'm just curious if there was an attempt to do that through the qualitative analysis investigation data.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So, for example, if we go back to the Arena Red study, we did it in a way in two ways. So on the one hand, we had the hardcore numbers, and of course you can debate whether they are really hardcore numbers. But of course you see substantially different responses, and you can see clusters of people in terms of their responses. And we independently initially first coded the qualitative data. So in this case, Arena and Tim Lewis coded all the qualitative data without knowing the clusters and without knowing the TPEC scores. And then we started to triangulate this and started to see, for example, okay, when people are saying something like in cluster 3, they were, if you just look at the numbers, there were 73 comments about negative experiences and only 4 from people who were highly performing. So by having this kind of a triangulation of data and continuously coding together, these patterns started to emerge. And I think that is what is really exciting about triangulating data from different perspectives. You could do it in many different ways. We could have also just started with knowing the participants and knowing who made the most scores, and then looking at the data or the qualitative diaries, whether we could see patterns. We decided not to influence the coders. But yeah, so I think that's why it's really interesting to think about the methodologies and why we've made certain decisions. And I'm feel free to criticize what we've done.
Wonderful. Well, it's 3 p.m. EST.
Yes.
But I know you're based in the UK and it's a bit late there, so I don't want to take much more of your time. But thank you so much for a really insightful webinar today. And thank you all for attending. And as I always say, I will always follow up with those who attended with the link to the YouTube video, the recorded session. And I think, Bart, you said you're going to share slides or something. So any resources you'll share, I'll also include in that email, and the links to the 2 books that Bart just published. So thank you again so much for your time, Bart, and everybody. And I hope to see you in future events. Take care. Thank you.